Thank you. I feel a bit like a retread since I gave the first reflection. I hope this one will be different from the first, but maybe an improvement. Let me also add that what a joy it is to share the platform with Sean, who has it. I have told him this before several times. His smile is infectious and wonderful, and I really appreciate it. This reflection will be about four phases and steps toward forgiveness, which applies to myself, as you will see. According to a book published in 2012 by Robert Enright called The Forgiving Life, there are 4 phases and, wait for this, 20 steps toward forgiveness. I promise you we'll get through them all. Professor Enright is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin, where I very much enjoyed my graduate education. He has spent more than 25 years developing a psychological process for achieving forgiveness. So this is an application, I suppose you could say, of clinical or social psychology. His essential idea is that there is so much injustice in the world and so much imperfection that just living in the world means that people disappoint us and that people will be unfair to us. And he believes that we need to find a workable response to that reality. His focus is chiefly on finding ways to forgive others. But I must add, he acknowledges this later in his book, I must add that even a more difficult thing is finding the way to forgive oneself. I have always had a problem with forgiving myself. I sometimes fondly dream about a mythical authority who could say to me, "Your sins are forgiven. Go forth and sin no more." That would have to be mythical for me. My problem is that I probably could never actually believe in that myth. Could you? Do you believe that anyone should tell you your sins are forgiven? My wife, Joanne, sometimes comforts me by saying that I am beating myself up over nothing. Okay? But it does not feel that way to me. Okay. Enright acknowledges that the person who is hardest to forgive is yourself. He suggests that if you can forgive others, your forgiveness should be followed by the words, "Now go and do for yourself what you have done for others. Turn that gentleness on yourself." He is probably right. So let us consider for a few minutes how Robert Enright proposes that we find a way to create for ourselves a gentle and forgiving life. His preliminary question is, who has hurt you? How deeply were you hurt? He argues that we should try to recall the circumstances of our hurt and reflect on the way we responded to the hurt at the time. Not easy. Then Enright moves on to phase 1 of his scheme, which he calls uncovering our anger. Okay, so remember there are 4 phases and 20 steps. Okay, I will cover only a few high points. In seeking to uncover our anger, we must do something that is, in fact, quite unpleasant, quite difficult. We need to recall our anger and focus on how we dealt with it at the time. Did we suffer shame or guilt? Did our anger affect our health, our physical or psychological well-being? Do we obsess about either the person who offended us or about the injury that we felt? Now, in my own personal view, there's serious danger here. I'm not sure that it's good or useful to recall the details of how angry we were before if all we do is restore ourselves to that same state of anger. We have to be careful about that. Restoring the same state of anger can be scary, and I'm not so sure it's useful. Phase 2 of his scheme is much easier. He says we must decide, make a decision to forgive. Now, I say this as a professor. I've been doing this all my life. It is easy for me to understand forgiveness as an intellectual process, but the psychological process of dealing with what are often gut-wrenching emotions is much more difficult. But that is the reason for Enright's next phase. Phase 3, he says, is working on forgiveness. This is indeed hard work, but we must accept the painfulness of the process. One particularly difficult idea of his is to offer the person who has offended us a gift. Sounds interesting, isn't it? Offer a gift, a simple gift, perhaps something as simple as a smile or a reconciling message. Whatever may be the means of expression that we choose, we must reach out and try to make contact with others. Now, that's always been difficult for me. When I was acting as an attorney for the ACLU, I represented students and their parents who had had some problems with local authorities, usually the school district. I encountered people who had done things to their students that seemed to me to be incredibly insensitive and uncaring. Now, some people, or many people, that would probably just make them angry. It made me sad. So I have a problem dealing with the sadness when I encounter that kind of insensitive behavior. I'll give you one example from a high school not far from here, and I won't mention the school or the district, okay? I had a young man who had brought a small amount of marijuana in the cap of a pen to school, and he was showing it around as kids do, and he was caught. So that became a disciplinary offense for him, so they placed him in what was called AEP, Alternative Education Program, where he entered into a contract. He agreed with the school that if he would do what was set out in the plan, that he would be forgiven and that he would be allowed to graduate with his classmates from high school. This was early in the year, and he expected to graduate in May. He did all of the things that were asked of him. He met all the requirements, but when it got close to graduation, the principal of the school told him that he would not be allowed to graduate. He was the first kid in an Hispanic family ever to graduate from high school. We arranged for him to transfer to another school and receive his diploma from another school. But I thought, how could you do that to a kid? How could you possibly be that insensitive? And that's what I mean when I say, rather than making me angry, it made me very, very sad that anyone could possibly do that. So, I find it difficult to understand why other people have acted as they do, and when I encounter that kind of mean-spirited manner, it makes me very, very sad. Okay? But, here's the important part. Apart from dealing with my own sadness, I had to learn to put others not entirely beyond the pale. personal solution for encountering others who have done what seems to me awfully uncaring and insensitive things was simply to decide to avoid that person altogether. Avoidance has been my strategy. That turns out to be a bad idea. You can't spend your life avoiding people who have offended you. It's a bad idea, and its consequences can make a person very, very lonely. Phase 4 has 5 steps. Enright describes it as a phase of discovery and release from emotional prison. Listen, emotional prison. What an interesting idea. What is to be discovered by this? He says, discover the meaning of suffering. What have we learned from this experience? How can we make things better? What insights did it offer? The second part, discover your own need to be forgiven. Is it possible to achieve the insight that we have offended others and that we are also in need of their forgiveness? Then he asks, discover that one is not alone. Seek to understand your connections with others. As you can see, as I've said, that's been a problem for me because I've often chosen avoidance. Avoidance doesn't work. It is too easy for me personally to be a loner. Discover, he says, this is very difficult for me, the purpose of your life. If someone asked you, what is the purpose of your life? What would you say? Have you thought about that? What is the purpose of your life? Okay, one of my problems is that I have always been too future-oriented. Okay, I can see things down the road, but what I have difficulty with is the here and now. I'm not very good at the here and now, never have been, and I probably at my advanced age will not learn how to be better at that. A purpose in life is action-oriented. How does one find a good purpose as you grow older, as I have? It turns out that it is exceedingly important to stop and recognize the good consequences of immediacy, to enjoy the small purposes and the small achievements that we may encounter each and every day of our lives. Now, this next part sounds like bragging, and I don't mean it that way. For whatever reason, perhaps it's electronic communication, the ease of sending emails. I have received this last few weeks about half a dozen just amazing notes from my students in which they've said things to me that are very, very important. I'm not bragging. You have changed my life, they said in an email. You have changed my life by taking your class. I know now what I want to do with my life. That means they're probably going to go to law school, which is not altogether a wonderful outcome, to be sure, because I am the pre-law advisor at TCU. But it's amazing to me how wonderfully nice my students are to me and how wonderful it is to have that experience. So if we can take that, Joanna suggested that I need to take those experiences and say, life is good. Enright gives especially high marks for the following statement. I fully understand my purpose in life. Can you say that? I don't think I can say that. That statement actually causes me mostly puzzlement. Okay? Now, just yesterday, I read about 2 new books that relate to Enright in a magazine. Let me tell you about these. These are really, really important books, I think. I haven't read them yet. I've only read reviews. Jeremy Rifkin's book called The Empathetic Civilization. Jeremy Rifkin, R-I-F-K-I-N. The Empathetic Civilization. and a second book called Humanity on a Tightrope by Paul Ehrlich and Robert Ornstein. Humanity on a Tightrope makes the argument that empathetic relationships, has been the main driver of human progress, and that we need more empathy for humanity to survive. We need to draw the circle inclusively, to include more people in our lives and to empathize with them. When I read the New York Times, as I did this morning before I came to church, and especially when the stories are accompanied by photographs about the awful things that happen to people all over the world, we have an opportunity, probably more than human beings have ever before had in history, to empathize with people, whoever they may be, wherever they may be. We have a glorious opportunity to be empathetic, to experience their hurts, their deprivations, the awful things that happen to them, and to do whatever we can to make that better. Okay. Rifkin calls this, wonderful phrase, global empathetic consciousness. Isn't that nice? Global empathetic consciousness. He sees us as the last best hope for, among other things, saving the world from environmental destruction. The last phase that Enright speaks of is called discover, this is a great phrase, I will love it, discover the freedom of forgiveness. By this he means that you, or we, or I, will have achieved emotional release from this wonderful phrase, emotional release from the prison of anger. You ever thought about it? When you're really angry and you can't get rid of it, you have put yourself in a prison. Emotional release from the prison of anger. I am trying very hard in my own life to appreciate the possibility of that feeling. Sometimes I make it, but just as when I began this reflection, I still have my own difficulty about forgiving myself. What about you? Are you good at forgiving? I'm not as good as I need to be. So, as we rise in body or spirit, please join our closing hymn, number 190.